The Golden King by Maladaptive Writing. Chapter 3 The Troll in the Dungeon. Regulus settled back into a routine at Hogwarts easily. It was almost as if he had never left in the first place. He was surprised by how comfortable he felt in Gryffindor, though the red ties and Gryffindor robes always pulled darkly at his memories, threatening to bury him the moment he let them in. He managed to keep them at bay easily throughout the day, but at night they always crept through his bed curtains and whispered disturbingly in his ear. The moment he slept, he would dream of strong hands untying a red tie, touching Regulus in a way that he had never been touched, before they slowly started strangling him, dragging him below the cold, icy water of the cave. He almost always woke with a shout in the morning, so he had taken to casting silencing spells on his bed curtains so he didn't disturb the others. He got on well with the other Gryffindor boys, although never always kept his distance. Ron had abandoned his suspicion of Regulus almost immediately and welcomed him into his life with an easy warmth. Dean and Seamus had become fast friends with each other, but they seemed to like Regulus enough. He didn't speak much to the Gryffindor girls, but he knew that one of them was keenly interested in his classwork. Hermione, he discovered her name was, but he did his best to downplay his skill when in class, trying to shake her watchful eye. Harry was always kind, which didn't surprise Regulus at all. Even though he hadn't been raised by James or Lily, or anyone that Regulus had known at school, he seemed to have their spirit and disposition. He tried his best to learn about Harry's home life and the Muggles who raised him during the first couple weeks of school, but Harry was always stilted when answering Regulus's questions. Regulus would give him ample details about his life, fake details, but still. My mother didn't want me to attend regular schools, so I've been taught by tutors most of my life. Did your aunt and uncle teach you themselves? No, I went to a Muggle school. Did you like your Muggle school? Harry cringed. It was fine. Every conversation went much the same. It was like denoming a garden, long and tedious with very little reward. Not that Regulus had ever denomed a garden. The Black family didn't even have a garden when he was growing up, and even if they did, they would have had the house elves to manage it for them. But he'd read enough books to know denoming was a menial task. As time went on, Regulus grew more and more concerned about the boy. There was something off that he couldn't quite put his finger on. But he wasn't sure what to do when Harry was so reticent to give details. The most surprising element of Hogwarts was Draco Malfoy. Regulus had never liked Lucius. He was always rude and condescending, so he expected nothing less regarding his child. Draco Malfoy did not disappoint. He seemed very interested in everything Harry did and would do his level best to mock him for it. For instance, Draco watched closely to see how much mail Harry was getting each morning, which wasn't very much actually. Wasn't any at all beyond a letter now and then from Hagrid. Then Draco would ridicule Harry for his lack of letters from home, often gloating about the packages of sweets he got from his mother. This would not have been out of the ordinary for a son of Lucius Malfoy, except for the fact that Draco Malfoy seemed exceedingly obsessed with Harry Potter. No other child seemed to notice how much mail Harry was getting, even though Harry was one of the most closely watched people in the school. Most of the student body was still vaguely obsessed with the boy who lived. Draco Malfoy, on the other hand, watched Harry closely and, in turn, needed all of Harry's attention. It was like he needed Harry to know that Draco saw everything wrong with Harry's life. Just what I always wanted, to make a fool of myself on a broomstick in front of Malfoy, Harry grumbled the morning they found out that Gryffindor and Slytherin would have their flying lessons together. Draco had been bragging about how good he was on a broom, even spinning some tale of escaping muggles in helicopters. Regulus had no idea how Draco even knew what helicopters were, given how he was raised. Regulus didn't learn about anything Muggle-related until he was a teenager, and that was only after he raided Sirius's room after he left home for the last time. Even then, it was mostly just what naked Muggle women looked like. He assumed it was the same for witches, though he wasn't a reliable source on that fact. Regardless, Draco was busy boasting about his flying ability, always doing so when he was sure Harry was paying attention, and Harry was always, sullenly, paying attention to it, stressing about the upcoming exams. Harry privately confessed to Regulus that he was more excited about the prospect of flying than he was about anything else at Hogwarts. This wasn't a surprise, considering James was flying since he could walk, maybe even before that. You're going to do fine, Harry, Regulus reassured him. Just ignore Draco. What if I'm terrible at it? Harry whined. The two of them were up late in the common room after the others had gone to bed. Regulus never slept well those days, and Harry didn't like to leave his friends. You won't be. I bet you'll be a natural, Regulus said. And either way, it'll be your first time on a broom, so even if you're not excellent, you'll get better, just like you have with every other kind of magic. Harry looked reassured for the most part, but Regulus could tell that he was still dwelling on the fact that Draco would be there watching him. Have you ever been on a broom? Harry asked. This was a tricky question for Regulus. In his first life, he was not allowed on a broom until he went to Hogwarts. He loved flying once he'd gotten the chance to try it, and often spent hours flying around the Quidditch pitch. He was even the Slytherin Seeker for a few years, dropping off midway through his 6th year when the thought of playing Quidditch and seeing James on his broom openly flirting with Lily Evans became too much for Regulus to bear. So he would likely still be a skilled flyer, and it would be difficult to hide that fact, but he also did not want to add to Harry's unease. "A few times. Not very much, though," Regulus answered vaguely. "Really? What's it like?" Harry asked, a sparkle lighting up in his eyes. "It's amazing," Regulus answered honestly. "The best feeling in the world." Harry smiled at that, his worries about Draco momentarily forgotten. Hermione was nervous as well, spending the morning spouting off tips on flying that she'd read in the library. Neville was nearby paying close attention to what Hermione was saying, obviously nervous as well. Regulus didn't feel like reading about flying would be of much help to someone new to flying on a broomstick, but during their first flying lesson, when they all watched Neville crash to the ground and break his wrist, Regulus wondered if he should have offered to give them more tips. After, when Madame Hooch left to take Neville to the hospital wing, Draco decided to steal Neville's Remembrall, and, when he saw that Harry was watching him, taunted Harry with it and threw it as far as he could. Regulus watched Harry soar through the air with a wide smile on his face. Regulus didn't even have the time to stop him. Yes, what he was doing was incredibly dangerous and would most likely get him in trouble, but Regulus couldn't deny the warm feeling he got watching James's son take to the sky like the natural he was born to be. Most of the time, Regulus had his occlumency walls firmly in place to keep out the thoughts about James. Of course, they slipped now and again, but during the day he was usually good about keeping them up. When they did fall, when a thought slipped through, Regulus often only felt sorrow, an anguishing pain that gutted him the moment he experienced it. Watching Harry fly caused his walls to slip, but instead of pain and regret and sadness and anger, Regulus only felt nostalgic, the warmth of love filling his chest. When he looked at Harry, he felt only pride. Draco, however, looked more annoyed than ever. It was clear that he'd expected Harry to be a terrible flyer, or at least get into horrible trouble for flying when he wasn't supposed to. This backfired quite spectacularly when Harry ended up on the Quidditch team as a first year. Only James Potter's son could manage something like that. But from that point on, Regulus understood exactly what was going on. There wasn't a moment when Draco and Harry were in the same room together that Draco wasn't watching Harry. And of course, Harry responded in kind by spending an unreasonable amount of time complaining about Draco, usually talking more than he had the entire day just ranting about the boy. Ron would often encourage Harry, agreeing with him about how annoying Draco was being, but Regulus stayed quiet. He did not want to be involved in the potion fire that was Harry and Draco, and he did his best to stay out of it. Naturally, this became difficult when Draco challenged Harry to a wizard's duel, and Ron accepted for him before Harry could even respond. "This is definitely a trap," Regulus said for the 3rd time that night. He had spent the last several hours listening to Ron give Harry half-hearted advice on how to duel. Regulus offered no such help. He was not about to encourage him by training James Potter's son how to duel, not to mention that he was sure they were all going to be spending the next several weeks in detention when they were caught out of bed. Still, Regulus wasn't going to let them go on their own. He was sure Draco wouldn't show, but if he did, Regulus wanted to be there to make sure no one actually got hurt. "Shut up already," Ron whispered furiously. "We have to go. It's already 11:30. If we don't show, then Malfoy's going to think Harry's a coward." "Draco isn't going to show," Regulus responded. "He's definitely setting you both up, and we're all going to get detention for being out past curfew." "He's setting all 3 of us up, you mean?" Ron said nonsensically. "You don't have to come. You could just stay here," Harry offered, not for the first time. Regulus grumbled at him, but still got up and followed them out of the door. Ron seemed fired up for the potential duel, but Harry mostly seemed regretful that he was even participating in it. Not regretful enough to say no, of course, but regretful all the same. Hermione was at the bottom of the stairs when they made it to the common room. In retrospect, Regulus should have realised that she would have been listening to them, especially with the way she watched him. "You can't be out after curfew," Hermione said sharply. "You'll lose house points, and you'll get detention or expelled." "Shove off," Ron grumbled, sidestepping her. "If you go out there, then I'm going to go get your brother Percy," Hermione said, sticking her nose up in the air. She was already dressed in her pyjamas, a silk set that made it look like she was wearing a tiny Muggle suit. Her curly hair was braided down into pigtails. Ron groaned. "Go away!" Regulus and Harry watched them argue as they walked out of the portrait hole, Hermione following them outside so she could continue to lecture Ron. He seemed to get a kick out of riling her up. "And you, Regulus, I expected you to talk them out of this," she hissed at him. "What?" Regulus had not expected to be dragged into this conversation. He'd actually been more than happy to stay out of it. Why would you think that? Hermione didn't answer this question, only gave him a very snobbish look before turning to go back to the common room, only to find the portrait empty. For now, she was stuck with them, unless she wanted to just sit outside the common room entrance where anyone could happen upon her. They found Neville outside the common room as well, slightly down the hallway, curled up on the floor. The poor child had forgotten the password and couldn't get in. The 5 of them made their way towards the trophy room, far too large of a group for a successful sneak around the castle, especially considering how far the trophy room was. The castle seemed much bigger now that Regulus was 11 again. The night went about exactly as Regulus had expected. Draco naturally didn't show, and they were almost discovered by Mrs. Norris and Filch, before being cornered by Peeves. Hermione took the reins when it came to reminding Harry that Draco had tricked him into getting in trouble, saving Regulus the trouble of delivering a certainly unwanted "I told you so." They sprinted through the castle, picking directions at random to try and evade capture. Regulus couldn't help but think of James and his brother, of their time as students when they would explore the castle corridors as freely as they could. He wasn't paying close enough attention to where they were going, and they ended up arriving in the forbidden corridor on the 3rd floor. Regulus had yet to investigate it, though it was still on his mind periodically. He had been wondering what Dumbledore was trying to hide there. It seemed too obvious a spot for something valuable. His mind drifted, unwarranted, to the locket currently tucked away in Grimmauld Place. They rushed inside stupidly, still trying to escape Filch and Mrs. Norris, and Regulus only realised a beat too late that Filch was probably the better option. Inside the door was a huge dog with 3 massive heads, impossible to miss, and Regulus damn near pissed himself. He suddenly felt very ill-equipped to have been sorted into Gryffindor. He wasn't brave. He was terrified. He pulled his wand, trying to remember some sort of spell that could fight off a giant 3-headed dog. He was the only adult in the group, though no one else knew that, and it was his job to protect the others, but he felt stuck, like he couldn't move. He edged around so he was in front of them, standing guard between them and the ginormous dog growling viciously. He wondered if he should throw himself at the dog's mercy, certain death, and let the others escape. Suddenly, he heard them all start to shuffle and fall backward through the door, and someone grabbed onto the back of his robes, pulling him with them. Regulus gasped for breath when the door slammed between him and the dog's snarling mouths. He was shaking from head to toe so badly that he could barely hold his wand. His heart was beating so loudly that it was the only thing he could hear. "We have to get out of here," Harry said. His voice sounded like it was coming from behind a very thick wall, far away and barely audible, but he grabbed Regulus's wrist when the rest of them started running and dragged him along. The trip back to the dorm was travelled in a daze. They ran the entire way and didn't stop until they reached the portrait of the fat lady. Regulus couldn't believe he had frozen like that. He was supposed to be protecting Harry, and he had failed the moment he was supposed to do it. He was too busy beating himself up to register the conversation the others were having, but it hardly mattered. He didn't particularly care why there was a monstrous dog in the castle. That was a problem for another day. All he cared about was the fact that he was completely and totally useless. Harry and Ron spent the next day trying to figure out what the package Hagrid had moved from Gringotts was. They'd already decided that that was what the dog was guarding, and Regulus was inclined to agree with them, though he didn't say so out loud. However, all they knew about it was that it was small. "It's either really valuable or really dangerous," Ron said. "Or both," Harry replied. Regulus thought that that was accurate, but he had no further insight to offer. There were so many magical objects out in the world that fit that description. Why Dumbledore would choose to store that item at Hogwarts of all places, Regulus had no idea. He was beginning to feel overwhelmed with the number of mysteries left to solve, and for the time being, the object being hidden at Hogwarts was not a priority. He knew that he needed to work on figuring out how to destroy the locket, but he didn't think the Hogwarts library was going to be particularly helpful on that matter. During one free period, Regulus found an empty bathroom and called for Creature. Regulus remembered during his first life when he discovered his house elves could come through the Hogwarts wards. He used that privilege far too often during his final years at school. "Master Regulus," Creature greeted when he popped into existence next to Regulus. He then bowed so deeply that his long pointy nose touched the floor. "Bring me all the books in Grimmauld Library that mention Horcruxes and anything on soul magic," he instructed. "Oh, and any of them that might mention dangerous beasts." Creature nodded, and by the next night, Regulus's trunk was stuffed full of most likely illegal books. He always wondered how Creature knew which books to pull. It wasn't like he could read, at least Regulus didn't think he could. It must have been some elvish magic that he didn't understand. After that day, Regulus started spending more and more time tucked away in different parts of the castle researching the subject. The books that mentioned Horcruxes ended up only being Secrets of the Darkest Arts and A History of Cursed Objects, both of which were mostly useless to Regulus. A History of Cursed Objects only mentioned Horcruxes in a footnote when referencing a cursed object that might affect a person's mental state, and Secrets of the Darkest Arts provided only a simple definition for what a Horcrux was, nothing on how one might be created or destroyed. I wondered how the Dark Lord had found out about them in the first place. He must have learned how to make one from somewhere, but perhaps it was by word of mouth, rather than through a book. He figured it would take more trial and error to destroy the locket, something that he couldn't do effectively at Hogwarts. In the meantime, he read up on soul magic, an interesting but not particularly well-researched branch of magic. He also spent more and more time looking up dangerous creatures, and though he learned a lot about dragons, basilisks, and chimeras, he could find almost nothing about large three-headed dogs. Time seemed to pass quickly in his second life. It was strange to feel so at ease at Hogwarts, but it was like a tiny sanctuary that made the passage of time easy and uninhibited. Harry was busy with Quidditch practice, and Ron almost always tagged along to watch, leaving Regulus alone to study. It surprised him when he looked up one day and found that 2 months had already passed and that Halloween was upon them. He worried about Harry from the moment he woke up on Halloween morning. He knew from reading The Prophet that Halloween was the day that James and Lily had been murdered, and Regulus expected Harry to be upset. He couldn't imagine how it must feel to wake up on a celebratory day, knowing that it was the anniversary of when you became an orphan. "How are you?" Regulus asked Harry as they walked down to breakfast. The smell of baking pumpkins filled the air, and Regulus felt a sudden deep longing for his first Halloween at Hogwarts. It was the only holiday spent at Hogwarts where he and Sirius didn't actively hate each other. The bad blood between them hadn't curdled yet. "Good," Harry answered happily, shaking Regulus from his memories. He smiled, but when he noticed Regulus watching him closely, he gave him a questioning look. "Oh, that's good," Regulus responded slowly, watching Harry for any sign that he was lying, but Harry just seemed confused. "Why?" Harry finally asked. "Well, it's Halloween. I just thought—" Regulus trailed off, feeling suddenly out of his depth. "Do you not like Halloween?" Harry asked, a look of sadness crossing his face for a moment, like he couldn't imagine not liking a holiday made of jack-o'-lanterns and candy, and that Regulus had just revealed something terribly tragic. It's not my favourite holiday," Regulus responded. This wasn't exactly a lie, though the truth was closer to something like, "This holiday makes me wish I'd never crawled out of that cold imp-fry-infested water in the cave, because at least if I was dead, then I would never have known that James was gone." "Why not?" Harry asked, a look of sympathy on his face. "Just a difficult day, I guess." Regulus evaded the question. There was technically no reason that he should feel that way, at least no reason that he could share with Harry. "Oh, I'm sorry," Harry said kindly. Regulus couldn't tell whether Harry was holding his emotions in, or whether he was genuinely fine. "I expected you not to like it either, I guess," Regulus said after a moment of hesitation. "Why wouldn't I like Halloween?" Does he not know? Regulus wondered. All Regulus knew from Harry's upbringing was that he was raised by Muggles, but it seems unlikely that they wouldn't have told Harry what day his parents had died. Surely they knew that Lily was a witch, why and how she died. Regulus thought about asking, but Harry was already skittish when talking about his home life, and Regulus did not want to add to it if he didn't have to, so he let the subject drop for the time being. Regulus watched Harry carefully for the rest of the day, but Harry showed no signs of being bothered. Ron, on the other hand, was in a terrible mood. Their morning charms class was filled with bickering between Ron and Hermione, something that was becoming worryingly common. Ron left the class ranting about Hermione and making snide comments about her lack of friends. Hermione, after overhearing Ron, didn't show up for any of their other classes that day. He wondered if he should do something, though he didn't know what. Soon enough, it was time for the Halloween feast, and Regulus let himself, if only for a moment, get caught up in the excitement of the day. He had always loved the decorations and the feast at Hogwarts during Halloween. Sitting in the hall, enjoying the food, he could almost forget that on this night, over a decade prior, the love of his life had been ruthlessly murdered by the Dark Lord. Regulus's ponderings were interrupted when Professor Quirrell came sprinting into the great hall, screaming about a troll in the dungeons. Regulus felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. Hogwarts already seemed to be a much more dangerous place than it had been his first time around, what with the barely locked corridor housing a dangerous beast, but now another one had made its way into the dungeon of the school. Regulus watched closely as the professors headed off towards the dungeon, and then began to follow the prefects up to the dorm room with the rest of the students. He stopped when he felt Harry pulling him and run aside. "Hermione! She never came to the dinner. She doesn't know about the troll," Harry said frantically. Regulus had barely paid attention to the details of the schoolyard drama between Ron and Hermione that morning in class, and he hadn't noticed that the girl wasn't at the Halloween feast, even though she'd missed most of their classes that day. But it was clear that Harry had been keeping track. Regulus thought that perhaps warning someone, like a prefect if they could find one, would be a good plan, but before he could suggest it, Harry was taking off running towards the girls' bathroom, and Regulus and Ron had no choice but to follow. Harry came to a skittering stop. "Wait," Harry hissed, pulling them behind a statue. Regulus followed before leaning out to the side just in time to spot Snape heading down another corridor in the distance. He wasn't going in the directions of the dungeons. "What's he doing?" Ron asked quietly. "I think he's heading for the 3rd floor, but I don't know why," Harry whispered. Regulus was surprised that Harry had picked up on that, but he thought that he was likely right. It was an astute observation. "Ugh, what is that smell?" Ron said suddenly, covering his mouth and nose with the sleeve of his cloak. The smell hit Harry and Regulus a second later. It was like rotting sewage. Regulus gagged. He'd only encountered a troll once in his lifetime. After Evan was killed by Aurors, Barty became more ruthless and reckless in his dealings as a Death Eater. He began to use unforgivables more freely, and occasionally would bring along dark creatures when they were sent out on raids. Regulus had no idea where Barty was getting these creatures, and by that point he was too afraid to ask. One night they were sent to a Muggle village, and Barty showed up with a 10-foot-tall troll in tow. It smelled so bad that Regulus almost threw up in his mask. When asked where he found the thing, Barty just laughed and started shooting stinging hexes at it to make it attack people. It was horrific, and Regulus spent the entire raid just trying to avoid the beast. The troll he was faced with now was much the same as the one Barty used. It had the same dull granite-grey skin and disfigured lumpy body. It carried a huge wooden club so large that it dragged on the ground behind the troll. Its head nearly grazed the vaulted ceiling. "The key is in the lock," Harry whispered as the troll entered the girls' bathroom. "We can lock it in." "Good idea," Ron said, already moving to twist the key. "I thought we came over here to warn Hermione, not kill her," Regulus snapped. Harry and Ron looked at him in shock for a second before they jumped into action, following the troll into the bathroom. Hermione was cowering against the far wall, and the troll was moving towards her quickly, or as quick as a troll could move, smashing the sinks off the wall as it went. Regulus was not about to repeat what he had done with the giant dog, freezing up and being completely useless. He had spent weeks researching how to fight off dangerous animals, and perhaps a troll didn't fall exactly into this category, but the same principles applied. "Stupefy!" Regulus yelled the spell, and summoned all the magic he could to attack the beast, but it barely affected it. He followed it up with another stunner, and then a conjunctivitis curse. The troll seemed more annoyed than anything, but at least it was focused on Regulus rather than the other children in the room. He threw a few stinging hexes, like he'd seen Barty do, but this only made the troll turn back to Hermione, like Regulus was purposefully egging it on. He felt desperation pull at his control, but he had spent years facing the dangers of his parents, the Dark Lord, and the Aurors near the end of his life, so he was more than equipped to use it to his advantage. He dropped his occlumency walls just enough to flood himself with the emotions that threatened to overwhelm him daily, the fear and the pain, and he drove it into his next spell. Confringo! His magic burned down through his fingertips, and he wondered how his wand managed not to catch on fire in the process, but the spell exploded out of him and hit the troll in the stomach. Only a moment later, he wondered if he should have used a less messy spell than a blasting curse, as all 4 of them were suddenly coated in troll innards. Regulus sneered in disgust, but the other 3 were frozen in shock, staring at Regulus with wide eyes. The door to the bathroom slammed open, and Regulus turned to see McGonagall, Snape, and Quirrell rush inside. "What on earth is going on?" McGonagall said furiously. "Why aren't you in your dormitory?" "Please, Professor McGonagall," Hermione said, her voice faint and shocked. "They were looking for me." "Miss Granger!" McGonagall's voice climbed up an octave as she yelled. I went looking for the troll because I thought I could deal with it on my own, because I've read all about them," Hermione said, tripping over her words as she went. Ron dropped his wand in shock, while Harry's mouth hung open. Regulus was also confused about why the girl would tell a lie to the teacher for them. She barely knew Regulus. They had hardly spoken to each other, and Ron and Harry were not exactly kind to the girl. There was no reason for her to protect them. "If they hadn't found me, I'd be dead now. Regulus, he—" She gestured over to him helplessly. McGonagall looked stricken. It was clear that Hermione had no way of properly delineating what Regulus had done, so the reference to the carnage around them was the only way she could explain. I stopped him, Regulus said. He crossed his arms and turned his nose up in a haughty gesture reminiscent of his past self. His gesture was slightly ruined by a piece of troll intestine plopping down off his shoulder onto the floor. How? Snape asked, a curious glint in his eye that Regulus did not appreciate. With magic, Regulus answered slightly. What spell? Snape said angrily. The other teachers seemed just as interested in Regulus's answer, but Regulus was very aware that an 11-year-old should not have known the blasting curse, let alone been able to use it well enough to kill a troll. Regulus shrugged, looking away from the professors. Well, in that case, McGonagall said when it came clear that Regulus was not going to elaborate, staring at them all. Miss Granger, you foolish girl, how could you think of tackling a mountain troll on your own? McGonagall ended up taking 5 points from the poor girl, but awarded 5 points each to Regulus, Ron, and Harry for their actions. That bizarre night seemed to bond the four of them together, though Hermione was looking at him like he was keeping a very important secret, which he supposed that he was. He knew that eventually she would confront him about the spell he'd used and how he knew it, but for the time being she just seemed happy to have a few friends. November brought a cold chill and the knowledge that Snape had been injured while trying to get past the three-headed dog on Halloween night. Regulus wondered why a professor would need to get past the beast, though he thought that maybe he was trying to remove it for some reason. But then again, Regulus knew that Snape was a Death Eater. How he had gotten a job under Dumbledore was a mystery. But regardless, he might be after the item hidden at Hogwarts for some nefarious purpose. He wondered if Snape knew that the Dark Lord was still alive. He didn't appreciate the way that Snape's suspicious sneaking around sparked the interest of Harry, Ron, and Hermione, though. The first Quidditch game was more stressful than Regulus would have hoped. He was secretly looking forward to watching Harry fly. He knew that it would remind him of James, and though the memory still stabbed through him like a hot poker, he couldn't help revelling in the nostalgia. Instead, Regulus had to watch Harry be jerked around on a jinxed broom. Regulus had his wand out the whole time, ready to throw a spell to slow his fall if he had lost his grip. It's Snape, look, Hermione said to Regulus and Ron. Regulus looked across the pitch to see Snape staring unblinkingly at Harry on his broom, muttering to himself. The fact that Snape would try to attack Harry so brazenly in the middle of a Quidditch match made Regulus reel back in surprise. Snape had always been careful, overly so in some ways, though he would share spells with other kids growing up. He usually held his plans and opinions close to his chest. What should we do? Ron asked, his voice panicked. Leave it to me, Hermione said. Regulus watched her rush down the stairs. He was too far away to hit Snape with any kind of spell, so he kept his wand aimed at Harry, prepared to catch him if he had to. It only took a few minutes before there was a huge commotion near the professors. Regulus missed it for the most part as he watched Harry clamber back up onto his broom before racing down towards the ground and catching the snitch with his open mouth. It was the most ridiculous way to catch a snitch, and Regulus laughed loudly as he watched, thinking about how much James would have loved this moment. Regulus followed them to Hagrid's after the game. Harry, Ron, and Hermione told Hagrid frantically about Snape jinxing the broom, and when he didn't believe them, Harry spilled the beans about Snape heading to the 3rd floor on Halloween night and being bitten by the three-headed dog. Fluffy, they found out its name was. Fluffy, the three-headed dog, belonged to Hagrid, and Dumbledore was letting him keep it in the castle. It wasn't there on accident, not that Regulus thought that that was really the case, but it was still bizarre to hear it confirmed. I lent it to Dumbledore to guard the... Yes? Harry said eagerly. No, don't ask me any more. That's top secret, that is. But Snape's trying to steal it. Hagrid seemed surprised that they would think that, as if Snape was someone to be trusted and not a Death Eater. Hagrid was dismissive, though he clearly didn't believe that Snape had hexed the broom either, despite the desperate pleas of the 3 children. Snape hexing the broom didn't surprise Regulus, though. Snape hated James more than anyone, and after James and Lily began dating, Regulus would catch Snape watching them hatefully. If Regulus had been a nicer person, he might have felt bad for Snape at the time, but Regulus was not a nice person, so instead, he relished in someone else experiencing the same pain he felt watching James and Lily fall in love. You forget that dog, and you forget what it's guarding. That's between Professor Dumbledore and Nicholas Flamel. Aha! Harry interrupted. Harry, Ron, and Hermione had no idea who Flamel was, and Regulus was glad for it, because the moment he heard the name, he knew exactly what was hidden at Hogwarts. The Philosopher's Stone, an item that could give someone immortal life, and who did Regulus know that craved immortality above everything else? This piece of information made Regulus more sure than ever that his plan to come to Hogwarts was a good one. It was clear that Hogwarts wasn't safe, especially not for Harry.